Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin with a simple but piercing question. How many more lives must be lost before we admit the obvious? The war in Ukraine has not brought peace, stability, or freedom. It has brought devastation, division, and a world teetering on the brink of greater catastrophe. For years, we have been told that endless escalation is the only answer, that sacrificing Ukraine on the altar of geopolitical ambitions is somehow noble. Yet today, we find ourselves staring at the ruins of this logic when Donald Trump says he will wash his hands of this war. He is not retreating from responsibility. He is exposing the hypocrisy of those who have turned Ukraine into a proxy battlefield for Western power. The courage to end war is greater than the arrogance to prolong it. This statement cuts through the fog of political rhetoric and reveals a truth that many fear to acknowledge. It is easy to start a war. It is easy to escalate. And it is easy to demand sacrifices from others while sitting comfortably in positions of power. Yet, what is truly difficult, what requires vision, strength, and moral conviction, is to stand before the world and declare that the cycle of destruction must stop. The arrogance of prolonging war is often disguised as responsibility, as strength, or as moral duty, but beneath the slogans and soundbites lies a darker reality. Prolonging war sustains the suffering of millions while serving the narrow interests of a few. That is not courage. It is cowardice wrapped in patriotic slogans. The hook is clear. Real leadership is not measured by how long one can justify destruction, but by the willingness to choose peace when others demand escalation. History is filled with leaders who extended wars out of pride, fear of humiliation, or the intoxication of power. Their names are remembered not with admiration, but with infamy. On the other hand, those who had the fortitude to step away from bloodshed, to negotiate, compromise, and to prioritize the lives of ordinary people over abstract notions of geopolitical dominance. These are the leaders who earned the respect of history. Courage is not shouting louder for war. It is whispering enough when the crowd is intoxicated with vengeance. When Trump says he will wash his hands of the Ukraine war, it is not an act of retreat, but of recognition. Recognition that endless escalation is not strategy, but stagnation. That real strength is not about how many weapons can be delivered, but how many lives can be spared. To embrace peace in a time of war is to risk being ridiculed by the warmongers, accused of weakness, or even branded a traitor to the cause. Yet this is the paradox of courage. It does not bend to public opinion or elite consensus, but instead carves out a new path that others fear to tread. The hook here is simple yet profound. The bravest step is often the step away from battle. The arrogance of prolonging war thrives on illusions. Illusions that just one more push will bring victory, that more weapons will change the course of history, that sacrificing another generation will somehow redeem past mistakes. But illusions are not strategy. They are the opium of the powerful, designed to keep populations obedient and soldiers marching. In contrast, the courage to end war is rooted in reality, in the recognition that every day of fighting deepens wounds, entrenches hatred, and makes peace more difficult to achieve. True leaders are not blinded by illusions. They confront reality with sober judgment. There is also an ethical dimension that cannot be ignored. To prolong a war knowing it cannot be won, to feed young men into a furnace of death for the sake of political pride is not leadership, but moral bankruptcy. Courage demands breaking this cycle, refusing to hide behind empty rhetoric about freedom or democracy when those very principles are eroded by endless conflict. Washing one's hands of a war is not abandoning responsibility, but reclaiming it in its highest form. It is to say, the lives of people matter more than the pride of empires. The hook is powerful. Ending war is not weakness. It is humanity's highest strength. This courage extends beyond Ukraine. It signals a new way of thinking about power and responsibility in the modern world. The unipolar era was built on the arrogance of constant intervention and endless wars, justified as moral crusades, but executed as exercises in domination. The multipolar world emerging today demands leaders who understand that escalation is no longer sustainable, that peace is the only true strategy for lasting stability. To end war in Ukraine is therefore not only to spare lives in one country, but to demonstrate a new vision for global politics, one where strength is not measured by destruction but by the ability to preserve peace. Thus, the courage to end war is not simply about Ukraine, nor is it about Donald Trump alone. It is about redefining what leadership means in the 21st century. Courage is not measured by how many missiles are fired or how loudly one speaks about defending values. Courage is measured by the ability to resist arrogance, to embrace humility, and to make choices that protect the future rather than sacrifice it to the failures of the past. The arrogance to prolong war may appear strong in the moment, but it is brittle, unsustainable, and destined to collapse under the weight of its own lies. The courage to end war, by contrast, builds legacies, preserves nations, and writes history with ink instead of blood. Ukraine deserves peace, not exploitation. This is not merely a slogan, but a moral imperative that cuts through the noise of propaganda and political theater. For far too long, Ukraine has been caught in the grip of forces far larger than itself, treated not as a sovereign nation with its own destiny, but as a pawn in a struggle between empires. To speak of defending Ukraine while fueling its destruction is hypocrisy of the highest order. To claim to stand with the Ukrainian people while ensuring their land becomes the battlefield of global rivalries is to exploit their suffering for geopolitical games. The real act of solidarity is not in prolonging their agony, but in paving the way for peace, for dignity, and for a future in which Ukrainians are more than tools for someone else's ambitions. The hook that cannot be ignored is this: true support for Ukraine lies not in fighting to the last Ukrainian, but in ensuring there is a Ukraine left to fight for its own future. Every new shipment of weapons, every escalation dressed up as support, only deepens the wounds of a nation already torn apart. War devours its own children, and the longer this continues, the less of Ukraine remains, its people scattered as refugees, its industries in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble, and its sovereignty compromised not only by Moscow, but by very Western capitals that claim to protect it. A country that becomes utterly dependent on foreign powers for survival is no longer free. It is merely traded between masters. When Trump speaks of washing his hands of this war, critics rush to condemn him for abandoning Ukraine. Yet let us pierce through the rhetoric. What greater abandonment is there than to lock Ukraine into an endless cycle of sacrifice, to keep it fighting a war that cannot be won in the hope of weakening Russia or preserving Western credibility? That is not support. It is exploitation. It is turning a proud nation into a tool, draining its lifeblood for the sake of strategies devised in Washington and Brussels. Real support would mean investing in Ukraine's recovery, encouraging negotiations, and helping it carve out a stable and sovereign path between East and West. The hook is sharp. Ukraine's survival depends not on escalation, but on liberation from being used. Ukraine deserves to be more than a buffer zone, more than a front line, more than a testing ground for Western weapons and a propaganda war against Moscow. A people with a rich culture, a resilient spirit, and a desire for self-determination should not be condemned to perpetual conflict simply because great powers cannot accept compromise. Every bomb dropped, every trench dug is not only a wound in Ukrainian soil, but also a scar across its future. The tragedy lies not only in the destruction, but in the deliberate choice to prolong it for geopolitical gain. Ending the exploitation means recognizing Ukraine as a nation, not a pawn. There is also an economic truth hiding behind the facade of support. Who profits from this war? Not the ordinary Ukrainian farmer whose fields are now littered with mines, not the families mourning their dead, not the children forced to flee across borders. The profiteers are arms manufacturers, geopolitical strategists who thrive on instability, and elites who see war as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. Ukraine's suffering becomes someone else's business model. The hook here is bitter, but necessary. Every day the war continues. Someone in the West grows richer while Ukraine grows poorer. To demand peace for Ukraine is not to side with one camp against another. It is to side with Ukraine itself. It is to say that Ukrainians deserve schools more than soldiers, homes more than trenches, hope more than fear. Washing one's hands of this war means refusing to let Ukraine be exploited any longer as a disposable instrument of strategy. It means recognizing that real friendship is not measured by how many weapons are sent, but by how many lives are saved. The greatest gift that can be given to Ukraine is not a longer war, but the chance to live beyond it. The time has come to redefine what it means to support Ukraine. Not as a battleground where others fight their wars, not as a symbol in someone else's ideological struggle, but as a sovereign nation with its own destiny. Peace is not abandonment. It is the only path that restores dignity to Ukraine. Exploitation may flatter itself as support, but it is peace alone that gives Ukraine the future it deserves. The hook that resounds is this: if Ukraine is to live, the war must end, not in endless exploitation, but in genuine freedom. Breaking free from the illusion of endless wars requires more bravery than fueling them, because illusions are seductive, while reality is often painful to confront. For decades, the West has been sustained by the belief that military intervention and escalation are pathways to peace, democracy, or progress. Each new war was presented as the final sacrifice needed to secure freedom, and each time the narrative collapsed under the weight of destruction and disillusionment. Ukraine today stands as the latest victim of this illusion. The rhetoric promises liberation, but the reality delivers devastation. The hook that cannot be ignored is this: endless wars are not fought to win peace. They are fought to preserve illusions. And it is precisely these illusions that must be shattered if any nation, including Ukraine, is to have a future. The illusion is powerful because it cloaks itself in moral language. We are told that sacrificing more lives is noble, that prolonging conflict is a duty, and that backing down is betrayal. But what is betrayal? Is it betrayal to refuse to send young men to die in unwinnable wars? Is it betrayal to demand that human life matters more than geopolitical pride? True betrayal is not in ending a war. It is in exploiting people's lives to sustain an illusion that victory is just around the corner. Every time leaders promise that one more shipment of weapons, one more round of sanctions, or one more escalation will finally bring peace, they are not speaking strategy. They are selling a fantasy. And fantasies cannot rebuild broken nations. History teaches us that illusions of endless wars always collapse, but only after unbearable suffering. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were framed as crusades for freedom, but they left chaos in their wake. Libya was promised democracy, but it delivered a failed state. Syria was targeted with the same logic, but became a theater of endless proxy battles. Ukraine now repeats this tragic cycle. To break free means refusing to repeat mistakes dressed up as strategy. The hook here is sharp. Repeating illusions is not wisdom, it is addiction. Each war is treated like a dose of hope, but the withdrawal always comes in the form of destruction and despair. Breaking free also requires intellectual honesty. Endless wars are not pursued for noble ends. They are pursued because they serve certain interests. They serve military industries that thrive on contracts, politicians who thrive on fear, and strategists who thrive on perpetual confrontation. The illusion hides these truths under grand speeches about democracy and freedom. But the reality is simpler. Endless wars keep the system alive at the expense of the people. To reject this illusion is not to retreat. It is to finally confront the system that feeds on human suffering. The hook is that once people see through the illusion, they can never unsee it. And that moment of awakening is the true beginning of change. Ukraine deserves honesty, not illusions. Every day that the war is prolonged, Ukrainians pay the price for fantasies written in Western capitals. The illusion suggests that Ukraine can be both the front line of NATO's ambitions and an independent nation. The reality is that the more it fights as a proxy, the more its sovereignty evaporates. Illusions cannot rebuild the destroyed homes, cannot bring back the dead, cannot give a future to a generation born into war. To continue living inside this fantasy is to condemn Ukraine to destruction. To break free is to give Ukraine the dignity of truth, that peace is not found at the end of more weapons, but in negotiations and compromise. The greatest act of leadership is to dismantle illusions even when it is unpopular. Washing one's hands of this war is not an admission of weakness. It is a declaration that the cycle of fantasy must end. The hook is bold, but undeniable illusions of endless wars make nations poorer, weaker, and emptier, while the courage to face reality is what preserves their future. To break free is to finally step into the world as it is, not as propagandists pretend it to be, and only in that world can peace and stability take root. Would you like me to expand key point 4 in the same 600-word Professional Diesen style so it flows as the next part of this series? A multipolar world demands a new vision, because the age of one power dictating the course of global affairs is not only fading, it is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. For decades, the illusion of unipolarity sustained itself on the belief that one nation and one alliance could set the rules of the international order and enforce them through military and economic dominance. The Ukraine war is not simply about territory or sovereignty. It is the battlefield where this illusion of unipolar control is tested and revealed as unsustainable. The hook is striking. Clinging to the old world of hegemony through war does not preserve strength, it accelerates decline. The only future is multipolar, and it requires visionaries willing to accept that cooperation, balance, and respect must replace domination, coercion, and endless confrontation. The unipolar system was sold as stability, but what it delivered was perpetual instability. Every war justified as defense of freedom created chaos that spilled across borders from the Middle East to Eastern Europe. Every attempt to enforce control sparked resistance, creating the very crisis it sought to prevent. Ukraine is the latest chapter in this cycle, where the drive to expand NATO eastward was presented as security, yet it produced the most destructive war in Europe since 1945. This is the paradox of unipolarity. It promises peace but breeds war. Multipolarity, by contrast, offers balance, an equilibrium where no single power dictates terms, but all are compelled to respect limits. The hook here is powerful. The world is no longer a chessboard for one player. It is a table where all must sit. The emergence of multipolarity is not a dream, but a reality unfolding before our eyes. Russia, China, India, and rising powers across the global south are asserting themselves not as challengers to order, but as co-authors of a new order. The war in Ukraine has accelerated this transformation, exposing the fragility of Western dominance as sanctions backfire, alliances fracture, and alternative institutions gain strength. For the United States and its allies, doubling down on confrontation may feel like strength, but it is in truth a refusal to face the world as it is becoming. Washing one's hands of the Ukraine war represents an acceptance of this new reality, that peace can only come from dialogue between equals, not the dictates of one power. The arrogance of unipolarity rests on the belief that compromise is weakness, that negotiation is appeasement, and that the only way to preserve credibility is through escalation. But credibility built on endless wars is nothing more than stubborn pride masquerading as principle. Multipolarity demands a different vision, one in which credibility is built on restraint, on cooperation, and on the ability to resolve conflicts without annihilation. The hook that should resonate is this: in a multipolar world, peace is no longer a concession. It is the foundation of survival. Ukraine stands at the crossroads of this transformation. To force it to remain a battlefield is to chain it to the dying order of unipolarity. To allow it to become a bridge between East and West is to align it with the possibilities of multipolarity. Real leadership recognizes this choice and refuses to exploit Ukraine as a pawn in preserving a fading empire. Washing one's hands of this war is not abandoning Ukraine. It is freeing it from being trapped in the illusions of the old world. Only in multipolarity can Ukraine hope to exist as a truly sovereign nation, respected by all sides rather than owned by one. The new vision that multipolarity demands is not utopian, but it is radically different from the failed formulas of the past. It calls for recognizing that no one power can dictate humanity's future. It requires humility, balance, and the courage to step away from destructive habits of domination. The hook here is undeniable. Multipolarity is not the threat, it is the opportunity. The real threat lies in clinging to a crumbling unipolar world through endless wars that exhaust nations, squander lives, and destabilize the planet. The time for a new vision is now. Washing one's hands of the Ukraine war is a signal that the future cannot be built on escalation and arrogance, but on acceptance of a world where cooperation is strength and domination is weakness. This is the vision multipolarity demands, and those who recognize it will be the authors of the future. Peace is strength, escalation is weakness. This simple reversal of conventional wisdom forces us to reconsider what it means to be powerful in the modern world. For too long, we have been conditioned to believe that true strength is demonstrated by military might, by the capacity to escalate, by the ability to impose one through force. Yet history and experience expose this for what it is, a dangerous illusion. The greatest empires fell not because they were defeated by stronger armies, but because they exhausted themselves through endless wars. Power that consumes itself is not power, it is fragility dressed up as bravado. The hook that strikes the heart is this: escalation is not a show of dominance, it is an admission of insecurity. Peace, by contrast, reflects confidence, foresight, and the discipline to protect strength rather than squander it. Escalation often masquerades as decisiveness. Leaders who call for more weapons, more sanctions, more aggression present themselves as strong and uncompromising. Yet each escalation draws them deeper into a spiral they cannot control. Escalation locks nations into commitments that drain resources, fracture alliances, and erode legitimacy. It feeds the illusion of strength while corroding the foundations of stability. Ukraine is a vivid example. The more the war escalates, the weaker Ukraine becomes, losing population, economy, and sovereignty. The West, too, discovers that escalation against Russia does not break Moscow, but undermines its own energy security, its industries, and its credibility. Escalation becomes the trap that consumes both sides. The hook here is undeniable. Escalation creates enemies faster than it creates victories. Peace, on the other hand, is the true measure of strength because it demands restraint when escalation is easy. To choose peace is to prioritize people over pride, stability over spectacle, and long-term security over short-term applause. It requires vision, because peace is not the natural outcome of human conflict. It must be built, defended, and sustained against the temptations of vengeance and domination. When Trump speaks of ending the Ukraine war, he is pointing to this deeper truth, that walking away from an unwinnable escalation is not weakness, but strategic wisdom. Washing his hands of this war does not signal a retreat, but the recognition that continuing down the path of escalation only ensures greater loss for all involved. The hook is sharp. True strength is not demonstrated in how many wars you can start, but in how many you can prevent. The obsession with escalation comes from a culture that confuses violence with credibility. Leaders fear that choosing peace will make them appear weak before rivals or even before their own populations. Yet the opposite is true. The greatest leaders in history are remembered not for how many wars they prolonged, but for the wars they ended. Escalation is reactive, driven by fear of losing face. Peace is proactive, built on the confidence that one's position is secure enough to compromise and negotiate. A nation that escalates endlessly reveals its desperation to maintain control, while a nation that seeks peace demonstrates its stability and resilience. The hook is this: escalation may win applause in the moment, but peace secures respect for generations. Ukraine's tragedy illustrates the bankruptcy of escalation as a strategy. Every round of escalation has been justified as a path to victory, yet each has left Ukraine weaker and more dependent. Escalation has not liberated Ukraine, but trapped it in a war it cannot escape. Real strength would mean securing Ukraine's survival through peace, not feeding it into an endless confrontation that erodes its future. To pursue peace is to give Ukraine the gift of existence beyond war. Escalation promises glory but delivers only ashes. The hook resonates. Peace saves nations. Escalation destroys them. The broader world, too, is watching. Escalation threatens global stability, disrupts economies, and brings humanity closer to catastrophic conflict. Peace, however, stabilizes systems, opens pathways to cooperation, and creates prosperity. In an age of nuclear weapons and interconnected economies, escalation is no longer just reckless, it is suicidal. The mark of real strength today is the ability to prevent destruction, not to flaunt it. Leaders who recognize this truth will define the future, while those trapped in escalation will consign their nations to decline. The hook could not be clearer. Peace is the strategy of the strong, escalation the crutch of the weak. Leadership is having the vision to say, enough. It is one of the most difficult words a leader can utter because it goes against the inertia of power, the momentum of pride, and the machinery of war. Say enough demands not only courage but clarity, the ability to look past the immediate noise of politics and see the long-term consequences for nations, for people, and for history. It is easier to escalate, to continue along the path already taken, to pretend that more sacrifice will somehow redeem past mistakes. But the real test of leadership lies in the willingness to stop before a tragedy becomes irreversible. The hook that must echo in every mind is this: weak leaders prolong suffering to avoid admitting error, while great leaders say, enough, to prevent generations from being lost. The temptation to never say enough is strong because it flatters ego. Escalating conflict creates the illusion of decisiveness and strength, while restraint is portrayed as weakness. Yet history consistently reveals that the leaders who said enough are those who saved nations from ruin. Consider those who ended wars when others demanded they continue. These are the figures remembered as statesmen rather than mere politicians. They understood that no amount of rhetoric, no volume of applause is worth the endless bleeding of their people. They recognized that wars cannot be won if they consume the very future they claim to protect. The hook is sharp. True vision is the ability to see beyond victory on the battlefield to the survival of a nation beyond the war. In the case of Ukraine, leadership means refusing to treat the country as an expendable pawn. Saying enough would mean sparing Ukraine the fate of being bled dry for the ambitions of others. It would mean admitting that more weapons, more escalation, and more promises of victory only lead to deeper tragedy. Leadership requires breaking with the herd, defying the voices that equate compromise with surrender, and recognizing that peace is the only path that can truly secure Ukraine's survival. To say enough in this moment is not to abandon Ukraine, but to free it from perpetual exploitation. The hook is undeniable. Leaders who dare to end wars are the ones who give nations back their lives. There is a profound moral weight in saying enough. Every additional day of war represents lives lost that could have been spared, homes destroyed that could have been preserved, future stolen that could have been lived. A leader who continues to escalate to save face is gambling with the lives of millions. A leader who says enough accepts the burden of criticism, the accusations of weakness, and the attacks from hawks, yet in doing so preserves the humanity of countless people. To bear that weight requires vision. It requires a sense of responsibility, not to ideology or prestige, but to people. The hook is powerful. History does not honor those who prolonged wars. It honors those who ended them. Saying enough also reflects a broader understanding of the changing world. In an era of multipolarity, escalation is no longer sustainable. The resources are not infinite, the global balance has shifted, and the consequences of prolonged war are far greater than in previous centuries. Leaders who fail to say enough are not only endangering their own nations, but destabilizing the entire world. Leadership today requires foresight to recognize that peace is no longer optional but necessary. The hook here is urgent. The ability to stop a war is no longer just an act of wisdom, it is an act of survival for humanity. Ultimately, the vision to say enough separates leaders from rulers. Rulers maintain the appearance of strength through endless escalation, but leaders shape history by ending suffering. Washing one's hands of the Ukraine war is not a declaration of weakness, it is an assertion of vision. The willingness to end a destructive cycle that others lack the courage to confront. To say enough is to resist illusions, to challenge arrogance, and to place human life above political vanity, and in doing so, it redefines as leadership itself. The hook that should resonate is timeless. The greatest legacy a leader can leave is not in the wars they fought, but in the peace they created by having the vision to say enough.